Welcome. We are talking about Genesis 1, so please have your Bible open and ready to think about this passage, Genesis 1. Uh, Before we get to that, though, we want to think a little bit about the literary nature of Hebrew literature. So, in particular, we want to think a little bit about how to show emphasis. Now, if you're texting your friend, you can use all caps, or you can put an emoji in, or you can underline something, right, or send a GIF file to someone to show emphasis, right? But how would an ancient author show emphasis? That's what we're really going to think about and think about. So, Tracy, Dr. McKenzie, what's one of the ways in which we can look for emphasis in a text?
That's great. Emphasis can happen a few ways in literature, and I think the lack of clarity on this is again what has made many bad interpretations, right. Because of course these Hebrew narratives are full of different points, and if you pick the wrong point on which to place your emphasis,
right.
You're going to wind up with all kinds of things. I think you mentioned polygamy at one point,
right?
If this is your if your emphasis, or Abraham getting up early is a common one, or something like this, then you're going to
sacrificing your son, maybe
sacrifice your son. You're going to end up in a wrong place. So one of the things that shows emphasis more than we recognize is the selection that an author makes. So another way to put this is, where does the spotlight, if you will, of the author go? If we look at these narratives or this literature through the eyes of cinematography, we can actually see where the author goes, right? If you're thinking of a movie or something, and the camera pans to a certain place, you obviously follow the camera because you don't have any other choice. Right? But if the camera pans to, in some drama, a key that got dropped out of a wallet or something, or a wallet falling on the floor, or a look that a man gives a woman, obviously the director is trying to guide your attention to this particular place. Well, we have the same thing in these Hebrew narratives, in this Hebrew literature. Where does the author draw our attention to? It's very interesting in Genesis 1, where he draws our attention to and where he doesn't draw our attention to. I mean, we often think of Genesis 1 as a science text, but notice there's no discussion of atoms here, like atoms, right? There is a discussion of atom,
right?
Just not atoms. There's no discussion of angels. Why didn't God tell us when he created angels? Why didn't he tell us when Satan was created, or when Satan fell?
Right.
Where did evil come from? Why cancer? Why didn't God just put John 3:16 right here in Genesis 1:2?
Would have been a lot easier.
It would have been easier in many ways. So, no, the author takes our attention as the reader, and he puts it in a certain place. Another great example of this takes us just one chapter out of Genesis 1, but I think it's such an important example. If you've thought about it, Genesis 2 really is about marriage, right? That's where Genesis 2 ends up. It starts in the garden with Adam and Eve, of course, but it ends up, the chapter really is all about marriage. Why in the world would God go to marriage in the second chapter? I mean, again, why didn't he go straight to the gospel? Or is he somehow getting to the gospel? Why didn't he go straight to the problem of evil? I mean, that's one of the major problems of philosophy. Why didn't he just go to that?
Right.
Why didn't he solve cancer? Why didn't he tell us about atoms, fusion, so on and so forth? So notice he doesn't do those things. He doesn't go to the problem of evil. No, instead in Genesis 1, back to Genesis 1, he goes to this creation of the heavens and the earth. And he even goes to it in an interesting way, in 7 days. So this idea of selection, I think, is important, and in a way that we don't often think of, actually gives us where the author wants to lead us, the reader, to.
Right. Yeah. Some other places besides what's included, what's not included. Maybe we could provide 7 more areas here briefly. to think about. And if you'll jot those down in a moment, we'll give you some opportunity to think about each one of these areas with regard to Genesis 1. And then the rest of our week, this week lesson will be in discussing kind of these different things. So here are the 7, and we'll give them to you. The first one is repetition. Repetition. So, is something repeated? And if it is, maybe that's pointing towards something that needs to be emphasized, right? And there's, as we talked about before, content is limited here. So if something's repeated, especially if it's repeated at length, then maybe there's something more to it than just, they couldn't think of anything else to write. Yeah. And so I'm like, so maybe your student papers, right, where they just repeat everything 3 times to get to the length. There's no required length for the book of Genesis, right? So if anything, shorter would be better. And so what is it about repetition that helps us? And that's actually a storytelling method as well, right? We always, when we speak or tell stories, we repeat important things, right, in the story, right? No, the key really did fall out, right? And the focus of the camera does that as well. So repetition is important. That's 1. 2, spoken word. So dialogue is always very important in these things, especially if you have multiple characters speaking to each other. Oftentimes that interaction is the focus. Now that's a lot different than our modern novels.
Exactly.
If we read Harry Potter, most of the book is just dialogue back and forth of characters. But in this ancient literature, dialogue is actually rare. There's not a whole lot of that.
That's right. I was going to just interrupt you just for a second, and as you relate this idea of dialogue, I think again I think we've been trained as modern readers to think of this as maybe modern historiography.
Right.
Or again, some sort of scientific historiography or almost a kind of a camera lens eye where we're seeing exactly what is going on. But I think, again, back to your example of the Gospels, which you use, which had 4 perspectives, we can actually see, no, the authors are given a little bit of liberty to style the speeches in a certain direction to communicate their viewpoint. So what you're saying in the dialogue is, no, there's actually a reason why the authors are relating these words in these characters' mouths.
They don't just have an iPhone or a dictaphone out and recording every and every thing that's being said, but rather that's actually cluing us into the thoughts of the characters. And sometimes the character is God. So we even get an insight into how he is thinking about these things through the dialogue that we see. Third aspect, so first repetition, second spoken word dialogue. Third is poetry. So poetry, as we saw last week, oftentimes has a certain way of elevating and drawing our attention in new and surprising ways. And so when we see, especially when we see the shift from a narrative or a narrative form into a poetic form, that sometimes clues us into something that's important. And the easy way to see that is most modern Bibles go from having just normal lines of text, everything's kind of to kind of broken lines of poetry.
More white space.
More white space, and that's how we know that we have poetry. The fourth thing is we look for the culmination of a story. So how does a story end? That oftentimes clues us into something important. Also, sometimes the story ends with the climax, but sometimes the climax is in a different point. So is the climax happening maybe before the end? We got to look for that. So that's number 5. Number 6 is the amount of information given, right? So if one particular part of a story gets an extreme detailed account, then maybe that's something important, right? Maybe the last how many chapters of Ezekiel that talk about the temple? Maybe there's something important about those that structure. We talked about Joshua. Maybe these land allotments aren't just something we can skip through quickly. Maybe there's something important about half the book of Joshua there that we miss. So the amount of information given is often important. And then lastly, number 7 is looking for clues of the overarching structure of individual stories as well. Is there something that connects the beginning to the end? We talked about the 2 concluding stories in the book of Judges, right? There was no king in Israel. Starts and stops each one of those stories. Maybe that tells us a clue about how we should read these stories. So what we would like for you guys to do now is just hit pause and take a few minutes to think about these 7 categories and think about what's included and what's not included, the selection category. And just jot a few notes down. There'll be plenty of opportunity to talk about this some more in a minute. All right, we're back.
We're back. Did you think about repetition?
I did.
Right? Spoken word.
Right.
Did you see any structure?
Yeah. What are some of these things? Well, let's just use the next few minutes of our time. Well, we could go on and on and on just looking at this one text in Genesis 1, right? But let's just spend a little bit of our time thinking primarily about repetition and the spoken word, because I think those are two things that right off the bat we see, right? And maybe I'll mention one, and then we'll kind of kick it back and forth, right? The spoken word aspect, right? We see that again. The author of Genesis 1 could have told the story in many different ways. He could have said, God snapped his fingers and the world came to be. He could have just said, God spoke and it came to be. But actually what he says is God spoke, and then we actually see the words of God speaking, right? Let there be light, right? And we see that there was light. And so we have this interaction there of the actual spoken word with the narrative. So at each point, and it's interesting that in each day, right, we see this aspect of spoken word come to play. So that is one of those things that we're seeing over and over and over again in the structure of Genesis 1.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I think we can contrast this very easily just to make our point a little bit with Genesis 2.
Yeah, that's a good point.
In Genesis 2, he doesn't speak, and then the narrator doesn't say, and God said, and then he speaks, and then it appears. Rather, he forms and fashions. So he's, in some ways, he's pictured more as a sculptor or an artist in Genesis 2. But in Genesis 1, it's really quite distinct.
Right. Yeah, we have these different, these are all metaphors for what's going on, right? These verbs, right, of forming and fashioning the man, or mounding up things, or separating things. We have all these different verbs that are used, but here we see something unique in that way. And that's the spoken word. And of course, we've talked about this already, going back to, even thinking about Genesis 1 and John 1, and thinking about Christ as the spoken word, right? So there might even be some connections there that we could draw in thinking about, our doctrine of creation there with the spoken word, right? There's something going on here that we don't want to miss. Talk to us about repetition a little bit.
Well, repetition, of course, is a key thing, and I would be very interested to see if you all noticed the repetition of these things. There's some pretty obvious repetition here. I mean, if you can't find structure in Genesis 1, you're in trouble. Because, of course, we obviously have the 7 days, right? And each day is structured the same way. We have, as Dr. Hardy said, and God said. We have repeated many of those days, let there be. And that's this idea of God speaking and saying, let grass, or let the light be, or, let the fruit trees give fruit. Something is letting, there's this form of a verb there. We have, and there was. So after God says, let this happen, something like that happens. We have, each, I can't remember if it's each day, but I think it's repeated several times, and God saw. I think every day except one, and God saw something, and then the judgment on that particular thing, and it was good. So we have that, I think, 6 out of the 7 days, or 5 out of the 6 days. Moreover, God names things. He calls the light day and the
dark night.
Dark night, exactly. And he gives, he names other things, Adam and the animal, or actually Adam names the animals, but fruit trees and so on and so forth. So he calls things. And then finally, again, probably the most obvious, and there was evening and there was morning for each of the days, and then that particular day. So we have this repetition, which really gives us a very pronounced structure.
So we're gonna pause here. We're gonna come back and we're talk a little bit more about how this repetition goes to develop a specific structure and a structure around each one of these days. And so we'll continue to think about this together.